What if the people who are least suited to lead are precisely the ones most likely to attain leadership positions? Imagine walking into a boardroom or a high-level government chamber and sensing an unsettling truth that the individual wielding the most power might also be the one least deserving of it. Could it be that our entire system for selecting leaders is fundamentally flawed? It's a disturbing thought, yet one that echoes loudly across history and into our present. Look around you. In politics, business, and institutions across the globe, a strikingly familiar pattern emerges again and again. Consider Richard Nixon, who ascended to the pinnacle of American power only to shatter public trust through the Watergate scandal. Despite his formidable intelligence and years of political experience, it was Nixon's deep-rooted paranoia, manipulative tendencies, and moral compromise that ultimately led to his dramatic downfall. But ironically, it was those very traits, his ruthless pragmatism, his calculated charm, his willingness to manipulate the system that helped him rise to such heights in the first place. Nearly 5 centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli recognized this same troubling pattern in Renaissance Italy. In his bold and often misunderstood treatise, The Prince, he offered this timeless observation: men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand. Because it belongs to everybody to see you, too few to come in touch with you. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few really know what you are. In essence, appearance outweighs reality when it comes to leadership. Machiavelli wasn't promoting deceit. He was merely laying bare a cold, uncomfortable truth about how human psychology intersects with power. Modern science has proven him right. Studies published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology reveal that individuals who display overconfidence are consistently rated as more competent, even when their actual abilities fall far short of the mark. Why do we keep mistaking arrogance for ability? Today, we're going to explore why our leadership systems consistently reward traits that should logically disqualify someone from holding power. Narcissism, dishonesty, and even reckless impulsiveness. We'll draw direct lines from Machiavelli's 16th century insights to modern psychological research and examine how these ideas help explain the alarming patterns we continue to see in boardrooms and governments today. But not all is bleak. There are exceptions, leaders and organizations that defy this toxic trend, cultivating authentic ethical leadership and thriving because of it. What can we learn from these outliers, and how might they help reshape our expectations of what leadership should look like? The prince must consider how to avoid those things which make him hated or contemptible. It makes him contemptible to be considered fickle, frivolous, effeminate, mean-spirited, irresolute, from all of which a prince should guard himself as from a rock. When Machiavelli penned these words, he wasn't merely listing faults to avoid. He was articulating a hard truth about power, that projecting strength and unwavering confidence is often more important than actually possessing those virtues. In today's terms, this helps explain why narcissistic individuals often have a powerful edge in leadership contests. Think of it like this. Imagine you're lost in the woods with a group of strangers. 2 people step forward, each claiming they can lead the way. One of them says cautiously, "I think I know the way, but I'm not entirely sure. There are several paths we might try, and each has risks." The other speaks with unwavering confidence. "I know exactly where we need to go. Follow me, no questions asked." Consider who would most people choose to follow. Even though the first person is being transparent about the uncertainty, which is natural and unfamiliar terrain, most groups instinctively gravitate toward the second person. Why? Because confidence, even if unearned, is often more persuasive than humility. Have you noticed this dynamic in your own workplace, community, or social circles? That near-instant preference for certainty, even when uncertainty may be the more accurate and honest approach. A striking pattern is revealed in the research. A comprehensive meta-analysis published in Personnel Psychology reviewed 54 studies, exploring the relationship between narcissism and leadership. The findings were clear. The very qualities that help narcissists get chosen as leaders: overwhelming confidence, magnetic self-presentation, and bold, sweeping visions are often the opposite of what is needed to be a good leader in practice. fact, companies led by narcissistic CEOs tend to experience 27% more volatility in performance. Even more telling, they are 33% more likely to face negative market reactions when making major strategic decisions. Why? Because their confidence often outpaces reality. Take, for example, the rise and fall of Adam Neumann, former CEO of WeWork. Neumann persuaded investors to value his office-sharing startup at a jaw-dropping $47 billion. Despite the company posting staggering losses, his extravagant vision and rock-solid self-belief allowed him to raise billions in funding and position himself as a revolutionary figure poised to reshape the future of work. But those same traits as grandiosity, his belief that hype could substitute for substance, played a major role in the company's collapse. When the numbers couldn't back up the narrative, WeWork's valuation plummeted by over 80%, revealing a devastating gap between promise and performance. The psychology behind this is surprisingly straightforward. Humans are inherently drawn to confidence, especially in uncertain environments. Studies have shown that people who project strong confidence, even when they are wrong, tend to gain higher social status than those who admit uncertainty. As one prominent psychologist put it, we prefer confidence to accuracy, a powerful, unsettling truth. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. He observed that nothing makes a prince so much esteemed as great enterprises and setting a fine example. In other words, the appearance of greatness often holds more weight than genuine ability. We judge not by the reality of the leader's hand, but by the spectacle of their performance. Yet thankfully, there are exceptions. Consider the remarkable example of former Botswanan President Seretse Khama, rather than building a personality cult or consolidating personal power. As many post-colonial African leaders did, Khama chose humility and long-term nation-building. He led his country not through theatrics or arrogance, but through careful pragmatism and a commitment to building strong, transparent institutions. Under Khama's leadership, Botswana transformed from one of Africa's poorest nations into one of its most stable and prosperous democracies. Its GDP grew from $69 million in 1966 to over $8.4 billion by 2000. Even more remarkably, the average life expectancy rose significantly from 52 to around 60 to 65 years, reflecting not just economic growth, but meaningful social progress. His leadership demonstrates that while narcissism might provide advantages in attaining power, steadiness, integrity, and genuine concern for citizen welfare can create more lasting leadership legacies. Over time, the impact of a leader isn't measured solely by how quickly they rose to power, but by the resilience and prosperity they leave behind. When you reflect on those rare leaders who've truly transformed their organizations, their nations, or their communities, have you ever noticed the crucial distinction between the qualities that help someone gain power versus those that help them wield it responsibly? It's an age-old question. Is it better for a leader to be loved or feared? Everyone agrees. In theory, how admirable it is for a leader, a prince, as Machiavelli puts it, to keep his word and act with honesty and integrity rather than rely on cunning. Yet, Machiavelli's realism shines through when he observes that, in practice, those leaders who achieve great things often regard keeping promises as a secondary concern. Instead, they rely on shrewdness and strategic deception to achieve their aims. This, perhaps, is Machiavelli's most infamous observation, that successful leadership often includes a calculated use of deception. Modern readers may initially recoil from what seems like an endorsement of dishonesty. But in truth, Machiavelli wasn't celebrating lying as a virtue. He was making a clear-eyed, empirical observation about what methods tend to work in the ruthless contests of political power. Importantly, deception in leadership isn't usually about outright falsehoods. It functions more like the misdirection used by a skilled magician. Picture this. While the magician's right hand moves with dramatic flair, capturing the audience's full attention, his left hand, nearly invisible, does the real trick. Political and business leaders often operate in much the same way. They highlight favorable statistics, dazzling headlines, and future promises, all while quietly burying setbacks, losses, or controversies in the fine print. When you consider the leaders you've seen in action, how often have they directed your attention to the elements they wanted you to notice, rather than what you truly needed to know? The psychology behind this tactic is compelling. Humans are wired with what behavioral economists refer to as optimism bias. We naturally interpret uncertain or mixed information in ways that confirm our hopes or align with our expectations. It's as if we're all wearing slightly rose-colored glasses, filtering the world through the lens of what we want to believe. Leaders who recognize and exploit this tendency can frame their messages in ways that appeal to many different audiences at once. For example, in corporate communication, significant losses are often repackaged as strategic investments, and modest gains are rebranded as transformational achievements. This reframing isn't necessarily lying, it's selective emphasis. It can be remarkably effective. Research from the University of Michigan supports this. Leaders who present company difficulties with a positive spin often see up to a 31% boost in employee morale and productivity, even when the underlying situation remains objectively challenging. It's a powerful tool when used carefully. Machiavelli captured this dynamic perfectly when he wrote that in The Actions of All Men, and especially of princes, where there is no court of appeal, one looks to the end. In other words, if a leader achieves success, he preserves and strengthens his position than the means by which he arrived. There will almost always be judged as honorable. As Machiavelli concluded, let a prince win and maintain his state, and the means will always be judged honorable and will be praised by everyone. But not all organizations operate this way. There are remarkable exceptions that challenge the conventional wisdom around image management and strategic deception. Take Patagonia, for instance. Under founder Yvon Chouinard's leadership, the company didn't just sell outdoor gear, built its brand on radical transparency. Rather than hiding its environmental impact, Patagonia openly acknowledged the footprint of its products. Even more boldly, it launched campaigns like, "Don't buy this jacket," actively discouraging unnecessary consumerism at first glance. This kind of honesty might seem like a risky move in the hyper-competitive world of retail, but it had the opposite effect. Instead of alienating customers, Patagonia's unapologetic authenticity drew them in, strengthened trust, built emotional loyalty, and cultivated a brand identity so unique and genuine that competitors have struggled to replicate it to this day. In fact, during this period of radical transparency, Patagonia's revenue grew from $295 million to $1.5 billion, while customer loyalty metrics exceeded industry standards by 38%. What does this tell us? Sometimes, honesty, especially when it defies expectation, can be more powerful than carefully crafted illusion. But there's a deeper lesson here, one that cuts into the psychology of leadership. Because often, it's the most dangerous deception isn't what leaders say to their followers, it's what they convince themselves to believe. A 2023 study in organizational behavior and human decision processes revealed a troubling trend as individuals gain more power. Their tendency towards self-deception increases significantly by as much as 42%. With rising influence comes a growing belief in one's own narrative, even when clear evidence contradicts it. This creates a disturbing feedback loop. Leaders who begin to believe in their own myths often become more persuasive to others, which further consolidates their power and deepens their self-delusion. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. This timeless insight from Machiavelli reveals something deeper than strategy, reveals the character of leadership. Wise and secure leaders tend to surround themselves with other capable, intelligent individuals. But insecure or self-deceiving leaders often do the opposite. They prefer to be surrounded by yes-men, flatterers, or those less capable people who won't challenge their authority or worldview. This dynamic introduces a fascinating paradox in how societies choose their leaders. Sometimes those who appear Intellectually simplistic gain public favor more easily than those who are nuanced or deeply thoughtful. It's what political analysts have dubbed the beer test, the idea that voters gravitate toward candidates they feel they could sit down and have a beer with, rather than those who might outmatch them intellectually or emotionally. This isn't just political folklore. It has a psychological basis. Social scientists refer to this as the pratfall effect, the phenomenon where highly competent individuals who display small flaws or relatable qualities become more likable and approachable than those who appear too perfect, too polished, or too cerebral. So consider this. When you look at the leaders who rise quickly in your field or community, are they the deepest thinkers with a nuanced understanding of complexity? Or are they the ones who speak in confident, simple terms, offering clear answers even in complicated situations? Have you noticed how we often confuse simplicity with clarity? George W. Bush's folksy communication style during his presidency provides an interesting example. Despite holding degrees from both Yale and Harvard Business School, he deliberately adopted a plain-spoken, unpretentious tone. For many voters, this made him feel more relatable, more trustworthy, someone who spoke their language. A more intellectual or academic style might have alienated them. The psychology behind this phenomenon is revealing. Humans have an innate discomfort with ambiguity and complexity. Faced with uncertainty, our minds instinctively search for clarity. We crave certainty even when certainty is an illusion. This is why leaders who provide simple narratives, bold answers, clear directions often gain more attention and support than those who speak with caution or complexity. Leaders who offer simple narratives and clear answers tap into this psychological need even when complex problems demand nuanced solutions. A landmark Stanford study of 952 CEOs sheds light on this tendency. It found that leaders who communicated using simpler, more accessible language were 23% more likely to be hired and received 16% higher starting compensation packages than those who used more sophisticated or abstract language. Simplicity, it seems, sells. But that advantage comes at a cost. These same leaders were 31% more likely to underperform when faced with complex and unpredictable business environments. Precisely the situations where subtle thinking, flexibility, and a deeper grasp of ambiguity were needed. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. He advised that a prince ought to have no other aim or thought, nor select anything else for his study than war and its rules and discipline. While at first glance this sounds like a call to arms, the advice is broader than just military matters. Machiavelli was emphasizing a focus on the concrete, the practical, the immediate rather than on abstract or overly theoretical concerns. This creates what we might call the complexity trap in leadership. The trap is this: those who are most intellectually and emotionally prepared to navigate complexity, the ones who can weigh competing truths and make careful decisions, often appear less decisive and confident to those assessing them. Their honesty about the messy reality of leadership makes them look uncertain. Meanwhile, those who oversimplify or ignore complexity can appear bolder, more in control, and thus are more likely to be chosen. Those most capable of navigating the actual complexities of leadership are often least likely to be selected for leadership positions because their acknowledgement of complexity makes them appear less decisive and confident than their simpler competitors. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. This iconic quote from Machiavelli captures one of the most enduring and uncomfortable truths about leadership psychology. The implication isn't that cruelty is good. Machiavelli clearly warned against actions that provoke hatred. Instead, he was pointing to a subtle but powerful insight. Excessive empathy can become a strategic liability in leadership. Modern science backs this up. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that individuals in positions of power showed reduced activity in the brain's mirror neuron system, a key mechanism for empathy, observing others in pain or distress. This doesn't necessarily mean leaders become heartless. Rather, researchers concluded that reduced empathy might be a functional adaptation, enabling leaders to make difficult decisions without becoming paralyzed by emotional overload. Think of it like a surgeon's emotional detachment. Imagine if a surgeon felt every cut as though it were their own body. How could they possibly operate? That emotional distance, while it may appear cold, is essential for making life or death decisions. Similarly, a leader faced with the responsibility of layoffs, budget cuts, or policy changes that cause discomfort or unrest may need that same sense of detachment to act effectively. Leaders often need to make decisions that cause short-term pain for long-term gain. And those who are too emotionally attuned to others' suffering may find themselves hesitating when decisive action is most needed. Does this resonate with difficult decisions you've had to make, where feeling too deeply might have made it harder to do what was necessary? This creates a troubling dynamic in leadership selection. In environments that reward confidence over compassion and decisiveness over deliberation, people with naturally lower empathy, including those displaying narcissistic traits, often find it easier to rise. They project the kind of emotional control and assertiveness that we, perhaps unconsciously, associate with strong leadership. Research from the University of California confirms this unsettling trend. Individuals scoring higher on narcissism scales were 35% more likely to be chosen as group leaders in experimental conditions. Machiavelli understood this long before psychology gave it numbers. He observed, "Men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived." These words cut straight to the heart of how manipulation can thrive when paired with charisma and strategic timing. Leaders with reduced empathy are often more willing to use deception. It's not because they lack intelligence, but because they are less burdened by its emotional consequences. Their decisions, untethered by guilt, allow them to act swiftly, even ruthlessly, when others might hesitate. This perspective ties directly into how virtues function in leadership. Machiavelli didn't advocate abandoning moral values, but rather adapting them as circumstances demand. He wrote, "Thus it is well to seem merciful, faithful, humane, religious, upright, and to be so but with a mind so framed that, should you require not to be so, you may be able and know how to change to the opposite." On the surface, this may sound cynical, but dig deeper and it highlights one of leadership's strangest paradoxes. Sometimes, traditional virtues like honesty or humility can yield worse outcomes than calculated pragmatism. Why? Because the impact of virtues is deeply contextual. A leader's greatest challenge isn't simply being good, but knowing when goodness helps and when it may hinder. Consider former German Chancellor Angela Merkel's response to the European refugee crisis. Her bold decision to admit over 1 million refugees in 2015 was neither purely empathetic nor solely pragmatic. It required a delicate balance, extending compassion to displaced people while simultaneously addressing concerns around national integration, resource strain, and political backlash. Had she leaned too far in either direction, the consequences could have been more polarizing, more damaging. True leadership in such moments isn't about rigid consistency. It's about intelligent flexibility. But are we truly limited to this cold calculus of calculated compassion? There are alternatives that challenge this Machiavellian realism. One powerful example is the servant leadership model, pioneered by Robert Greenleaf in the 1970s. According to this approach, leaders who put their followers' needs above personal ambition tend to achieve not only ethical integrity, but also stronger long-term results. Costco's leadership under CEO Jim Sinegal is a case in point. Rather than chasing short-term profit through labor cuts or underpaying staff, Sinegal took a radically different path. He offered wages 40% above the industry average and provided health benefits to 85% of employees, compared to just 47% among competitors. The payoff was unmistakable. Employee turnover at Costco dropped to just 17%, far below the industry norm of 44%. And perhaps most impressively, during Sinegal's tenure, Costco's stock outperformed Walmart's by a remarkable 300%. What does this tell us? It reinforces that the real challenge in leadership isn't choosing between virtue and effectiveness, but learning to align the right virtues with the demands of each unique situation. Sometimes kindness must lead, other times firmness is required. Wisdom lies in the ability to discern which serves the greater good. As Aristotle, whom Machiavelli had undoubtedly studied, argued, virtue isn't about following rigid rules, but applying principles appropriately to each unique situation, for there is such a difference between how one lives and how one ought to live, that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. This profound observation from Machiavelli encapsulates one of the core dilemmas of leadership in any era, the tension between idealism and reality. It speaks directly to the fundamental problem of how leaders are selected in modern systems. The qualities that enable a candidate to win a leadership contest, charisma, showmanship, confidence, are often entirely different from, and occasionally even opposed to, it. The attributes that define successful leadership after assuming power. Imagine casting an actor to portray a doctor in a film. You might choose someone tall, confident, impeccably groomed, someone who visually fits society's archetype of a medical professional. But would you trust that same person to perform surgery in a real operating room? Of course not. The traits that impress an audience aren't the same ones that save lives. And yet, in politics, business, and even nonprofits, this kind of casting mistake happens all the time. Candidates who perform the appearance of leadership most convincingly are often rewarded over those who would practice it most competently. How many times have you witnessed the most genuinely qualified person lose out to a more polished, charismatic performer? This is not just anecdotal, it's an established psychological pattern. Numerous studies have confirmed that individuals with narcissistic tendencies are more likely to be perceived as leaders in group scenarios. But here lies the irony. Once in power, those same narcissistic traits often correlate with poor leadership performance, short-sighted decisions, and low group morale. This contradiction has been labeled by researchers as the leadership paradox, a phenomenon where the traits that elevate individuals into leadership positions are the very ones that can make them ineffective or even destructive once they assume the role. The deeper psychology behind this paradox is rooted in our evolutionary history. Over millennia, human beings have developed mental shortcuts to identify leaders in moments of uncertainty or threat. We're drawn to signals of dominance, decisiveness, and strength, traits that may have conferred survival advantages in tribal, higher-risk environments. In those ancestral settings, the ability to intimidate enemies or assert control in crises may have been more useful than empathy or collaborative thinking. But in today's organizations where innovation, cooperation, and emotional intelligence are critical, those same dominance cues can lead us astray. Research from the University of California offers a startling revelation. The traits we instinctively associate with leadership today, such as height, a deep voice, confident body language, and assertive social behavior, are strikingly similar to those that influence leadership hierarchies in chimpanzee troops. Yes, despite all our progress, our instincts for choosing leaders often remain primitive. The problem is, these traits have little to no connection with actual leadership effectiveness in complex modern institutions. Yet our brains continue to respond to them. This mismatch between instinct and reality leads to a deeply flawed system, one where we reward the illusion of leadership while neglecting its substance. Machiavelli recognized this tension centuries ago. He noted, "The people are the masses. The nobility are the leadership class who wish to rule over the people. The people have one simple desire: not to be dominated or oppressed by the powerful. The nobility merely want to dominate and oppress the people. These competing desires fuel a cycle that is both persistent and dangerous. This creates a troubling cycle. Our modern methods of leadership selection across sectors and societies may be systematically choosing the wrong kinds of individuals for the most important roles. The consequences are not just inefficient organizations, but widespread disillusionment with leadership itself. Those most eager to lead are often those least suited to do so wisely, while those who would lead most effectively are often reluctant to pursue power. This paradox is as old as leadership itself. Consider Nelson Mandela, who became South Africa's President not through aggressive power-seeking or manipulation, but rather through the moral authority he earned during 27 long years of imprisonment. His leadership style, deeply rooted in reconciliation rather than revenge, powerfully demonstrates how leaders who don't fit the traditional Machiavellian mold can still drive transformational change. Similarly, Abraham Lincoln was initially dismissed by many as awkward and unpolished, a simple man in manner and speech, yet it was precisely his thoughtful, empathetic leadership that uniquely suited him to guide America through its gravest crisis, the Civil War. These striking exceptions highlight that although our default leadership selection systems often favor narcissists and manipulators, alternative models do exist and can succeed. Machiavelli famously observed, "Therefore it is unnecessary for a prince to have all the good qualities I have enumerated, but it is very necessary to appear to have them." This famously cynical remark captures his pragmatic approach to leadership ethics. But it would be a mistake to interpret him as simply endorsing deception for its own sake. Rather, Machiavelli was keenly aware of the psychological reality that perception often matters more than reality in leadership contexts. He was challenging leaders and societies alike to recognize this truth and rethink how they choose those who lead. If, as Machiavelli argued, appearance often trumps reality when it comes to leadership selection, the question becomes, how can we ensure that our leaders genuinely possess the qualities needed for effective governance and stewardship? How do we pierce through superficial charisma and see the true character beneath? The answer may lie in redesigning our leadership selection systems to better account for these ingrained psychological biases. History offers some fascinating examples. For instance, the Venetian Republic employed an intricate system blending election with random selection to choose its doge, the chief magistrate. This unusual combination was designed partly to prevent any single faction from monopolizing power and to guard against corruption. Other societies took the bold step of requiring leaders to periodically relinquish control, thereby preventing the psychological corruption and entitlement that can build with extended tenure. In the modern era, some organizations are experimenting with similar innovations. Take Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund, as a compelling example. Under founder Ray Dalio's leadership, Bridgewater practices what he terms radical transparency, culture where employees at all levels are encouraged to openly critique leadership decisions, and even the CEO's performance is subject to anonymous, candid feedback. This approach is designed to prevent the echo chambers that typically nurture and reinforce narcissistic leadership styles. Drawing from both Machiavellian wisdom and modern psychological research, there are concrete reforms organizations can adopt to shield themselves from manipulative or corrupt leadership. By acknowledging the complex interplay between perception and reality, and by building systems that encourage accountability and diverse input, it becomes possible to select leaders who not only appear capable, but who truly are equipped to lead. Wisely and ethically, first, they should prioritize actual outcomes over interview performance. Research consistently shows that a candidate's past behavior is a far more reliable predictor of future actions than how well they perform in a high-pressure interview situation. After all, anyone can prepare answers or rehearse responses, but real-world results reveal true capability. Therefore, organizations need to look beyond polished presentations and focus on tangible evidence of leadership effectiveness. Next, instead of granting leaders permanent positions immediately, there should be mandatory trial or probationary periods. During these times, comprehensive feedback must be gathered from all levels within the organization, a process commonly known as a 360 review. This approach ensures a well-rounded view of the leader's performance, highlighting both strengths and weaknesses before any long-term commitments are made. By incorporating diverse perspectives, organizations can reduce the risk of appointing leaders who perform well only in front of higher-ups but fail to inspire or manage their teams effectively. Another critical safeguard involves separating the power to propose actions from the power to approve them. When a single individual holds both authorities, it creates a dangerous concentration of influence. leaving the door wide open for unchecked manipulation and poor decision-making. This separation of powers encourages transparency and accountability, ensuring that proposals undergo careful scrutiny before implementation to further prevent groupthink, a phenomenon where dissenting voices are silenced and critical thinking is stifled. Organizations should assign a formal role of devil's advocate. This person's responsibility is to actively challenge assumptions, question the leader's decisions, and make sure alternative viewpoints are considered. By institutionalizing such a role, organizations create an environment where healthy debate is encouraged, ultimately leading to better informed and more resilient decisions. Finally, implementing term limits and rotating leadership positions can effectively counteract the psychological decay and corruption that often accompany long tenures in power. Power left unchecked tends to corrupt, a truth Machiavelli understood deeply. Leadership that stretches indefinitely risks becoming self-serving rather than serving the broader good. Perhaps most importantly, Machiavelli's insights remind us to focus less on the individual qualities of leaders and more on building strong institutional constraints. As he famously wrote, "A prince, therefore, being compelled knowingly to adopt the beast, it to choose the fox and the lion, because the lion cannot defend himself against snares, and the fox cannot defend himself against wolves." The fox symbolizes strategic wisdom, the ability to detect deception and navigate the complexities of social environments, while the lion represents moral courage, standing firm on ethical principles despite opposition. But maybe the greatest lesson isn't about cultivating flawless leaders at all, but about creating systems so robust that even flawed leaders can produce good outcomes. What examples of such systems have you encountered where checks and balances prevent the worst abuses of leadership? James Madison, one of America's founding fathers, clearly understood this Machiavellian principle when designing the U.S. Constitution. He famously said, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." Recognizing human imperfection, Madison crafted a system of checks and balances deliberately designed to function effectively even when self-interested. Imperfect leaders are in power. This is a truly Machiavellian solution in its best and most pragmatic sense. Modern research in organizational psychology supports this idea, suggesting that leadership effectiveness depends far more on context and the surrounding system than on individual leaders themselves. The structures and processes put in place often make the decisive difference between success and failure. The same person who thrives in one leadership role may fail in another, not because their character changes, but because different contexts reward different attributes. This important insight reminds us that leadership is never one size fits. What works in one situation may be a liability in another. Therefore, instead of obsessing over finding perfect leaders, our focus should shift toward designing systems that bring out the best qualities in the leaders we already have. Throughout this exploration, we've uncovered why leadership so often rewards narcissists, liars, and fools. Not because these traits inherently make for good leadership, but because they offer distinct advantages in the processes used to select leaders. We have seen how Machiavelli's insights from Renaissance Italy align remarkably well with modern psychological research on power, perception, and leadership dynamics. Yet, alongside these sobering truths, we have also identified exceptions to these patterns and uncovered potential solutions. The uncomfortable reality is that our leadership selection systems, whether in politics, business, or other domains, often favor the wrong traits. We tend to reward confidence over competence, charisma over character, and decisive simplicity over the nuanced, thoughtful complexity leadership truly requires. This unfortunate pattern isn't due to a conscious preference for poor leaders. Rather, it stems from deep-seated psychological biases that make us vulnerable to certain types of influence and impression management. Machiavelli's most profound insight wasn't merely that the world rewards vice over virtue, but that effective leadership demands an honest understanding of human psychology as it is, not as we wish it to be. Many thinkers have imagined republics and principalities guided by ideals that have never actually existed. As Machiavelli observed, "For how we live is so far removed from how we ought to live, that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done will rather learn to bring about his own ruin than his preservation. This stark observation speaks to the gap between idealism and reality, cautioning us against naivete in leadership expectations, yet recognizing and understanding these challenging dynamics is the crucial first step toward meaningful change. We can design leadership selection processes that emphasize track records over performances, because past behavior remains the most reliable predictor of future actions. Unlike interviews or debates which often reward theatrical skill and polished rhetoric, evaluating real-world outcomes provides a clearer picture of a candidate's true leadership capacity. Moreover, organizations can implement institutional safeguards that limit the damage narcissistic or manipulative leaders can inflict. Tools such as term limits, power-sharing arrangements, and robust accountability mechanisms create essential checks that protect institutions. Even when flawed individuals assume power, these systems act like guardrails, preventing leadership from veering off course when charisma or deceit threaten to overshadow substance. Finally, perhaps the most powerful defense lies in educating ourselves about these psychological patterns. By learning how narcissism, strategic deception, false simplicity manipulate our perceptions of leadership, we become less susceptible to their allure. We can cultivate the critical ability to distinguish between genuine confidence and narcissistic self-promotion, between strategic communication and manipulative deception, between accessible simplicity and intellectual laziness. This awareness empowers us to see leaders more clearly and demand better, more effective leadership. The same person who thrives in one leadership role may fail in another, not because their character changes, but because different contexts reward different attributes. Thus, understanding these realities is essential if we hope to select and support leaders who can truly guide us wisely. The truly Machiavellian leader, in the best and most profound sense of the term, is one who sees clearly through the intricate games of power, yet never loses sight of a moral compass that steadfastly points toward genuine human flourishing. This leader understands that power is not merely a tool for self-aggrandizement or domination, but a responsibility to foster the well-being of those they serve. At the same time, the truly Machiavellian citizen is not naive. They comprehend these complex dynamics well enough to recognize and select leaders who will prioritize the common good rather than their own grandiosity or personal gain. Have you ever witnessed leadership selection go terribly wrong, or the process rewarded charisma or deception over integrity and capability? Perhaps you have encountered a leader who, despite the pressures and temptations of power, managed to rise without succumbing to the darker patterns of manipulation or narcissism. What lessons did those experiences teach you about the true nature of leadership and the pitfalls of our selection systems? I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts and stories. Drop them in the comments below, and let's start a meaningful conversation. If this exploration of leadership psychology resonated with you, or if you know someone in a position of influence, or with a perspective that could benefit from these insights, please consider sharing it with them. Sometimes, the right insight delivered at the right moment can profoundly shift how someone sees the world and their role within it. Together, by broadening awareness and deepening understanding, we can foster leadership that truly serves. If you found value in this discussion, don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden patterns and psychological truths that quietly shape our societies, organizations, and everyday lives. Till next time, remember, in a world that often rewards princes, be wise enough to see clearly through the glittering crown.